said, he has a high ball, which means in an old train yard you would have a pole. On the top of that pole would be a red ball. If the red ball was at the top, it was called a high ball, and that meant the engineer could go through the yard. If the ball was anywhere except the top, then the engineer needed to stop and wait for instructions. So this is the National Railroad Museum. It is designated as the National Railroad Museum, and it is the only one so designated in the United States by an act of Congress in 1958. We actually started as a museum in a park in 1956 by a group of local businessmen. They wanted to bring a steam engine here and park it on the grounds for people to see. And they gave children rides on steam engines and little steam engines. This was called Cook's Park. And in the park you saw engines like the one in the traffic circle here, as well as the one that's in the gift shop. Both of those were live steam, and they gave children rides around the park. Now the museum grew and grew until today, where we have over 70 pieces of rolling stock and 100,000 items in our collection. Now some of the rolling stock, which we call anything that rolls on the rails rolling stock, is this funny looking piece here that's the kind of rust color, has some wings on it. Everybody thinks that's a snowplow, but it's actually designed as a big giant weed whacker. Those wings would come out of the sides of that car. It's called a Jordan spreader. The wings would come out and cut down any brush or trees that grew up along the tracks. It's also called a spreader because it would spread the ballast or the stones that you see underneath the rail ties and the rails that we are riding on now. If it wasn't for those stones, because of the weight of the train, we would sink into the ground as well as the rails would sink into the ground, so we wouldn't be able to move. Now on our left, we're about to pass our observation tower. The weather's kind of yucky today, so you probably don't want to climb up there, but it's 99 steps to the top and 85 feet tall. You can see land going up and down the Fox River from there. Once in a while, we see bald eagles in the area. We know they eat their lunch up there because unfortunately we find a dead fish at the top of the tower. Yeah, it caught me. When we catch those, or sometimes we scare the eagles up there, and then we find walleye 85 feet up. In this building here, that's the open one, it's called the McCormick Pavilion. You'll see a number of steam engines in there, some rail cars. There's 3 cars that you can go in. There's a postal car here right at the end with a ladder on it. It's a rolling post office. Next to that is a dome dining car and then a Pullman car. You can walk through all of those. They were last used over 50 years ago, and they have what we call the smell of history to them. So if you happen to go in there, especially on a nice moist day like today, I can imagine it smells pretty mildewy in there. But you do get a flavor of what it was like to travel in those cars. The gray building to the left here is where we do our restorations. The car that we're working on right now is called the Dothan. It is a dining car from the Atlantic coastline from about the 1920s. It's a really, really heavy car, and it has big axles on it. It has 3 wheels, 3 axles on each end, so it's got 18 wheels. It's very, very smooth. When we had to go around the tracks just the other day, it ran really smooth and very quiet. And we heard that that's how it was like when they used to run that. We thought that it was going to be really, really noisy because it hasn't been running in any design, but we're hoping for next year. And it's a full dining car. It has a kitchen in it that's half as long as this car. It's really huge. And then it's got a big dining area. Now we're crossing over Dutchman's Creek. That's what you see to the right. To the left is the Fox River. Fox River has a unique thing about it. It's one of the few rivers in the world that flows north in the northern hemisphere. You can see the 172 bridge there too. So now we're crossing over, and on the left-hand side, we'll pass through what we call our Hobo Village. Hobo Village, or Hooverville, as they called them during the Depression, were campgrounds where the hobos would live. Boy Scouts that come here and spend the night, and sometimes they use this campground. have seen the skull that's on the engine. That's because part of the experience for Terror on the Fox is a train ride. You board the train, you ride around, then you get off and you go through the haunted house. So there's strobe lights on this car, there's music, there's actors on the car, so it's all part of the experience. As we go by Terror on the Fox to the right, you'll see 2 rail cars parked on the side. They're used by the Terror people. Those cars are sister cars to the one you're riding in. When they came here to the property, they were named X, Y, and Z. I don't know which was which, but this car that you're riding in was chosen to be the one to get fully restored. These cars are all called bus cars, and it's probably pretty self-explanatory why that is. I think all of you have probably ridden in a yellow school bus, and it's not much different than the seats that you're riding in now. It's just as uncomfortable, has no circulation, and the windows go up and down about the same way too. So this was called a bus car. It ran in the 1920s. It's named after Miss Josephine Linfesti. She and her husband were patrons of the museum, and they helped sponsor the building there that houses our engines called the Linfesti Center, and you can see their pictures outside of it. Her name was Josephine, and this car is named after her. Bathroom with a shower, and they would live in that car. They would travel on the train, and it would measure the pull of the engine. So the engineer in there would look and see how much more weight the engine could pull, and he could tell the conductor to add cars to the train, or that he might have to take cars off the train. It also would measure the speed.